Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace from my atheist perspective. In this video, I'm going to cover chapter 12 of the book, which is titled, Were They Corroborated? We're, of course, now in section 2, where we are examining the supposed evidence for the authenticity of the Gospels. And in this chapter, Wallace is going to describe for us the importance of the corroborating evidence for the authenticity of the Gospels. And Wallace begins by acknowledging that skeptics of the historical reliability of the Bible expect to see corroborating evidence of its claims, especially its claims that miraculous events occurred. Now, to illustrate how corroborating evidence works, Wallace tells a story from his detective days about a witness named Amy who came forward to say that she saw a murder suspect named Danny standing outside the murder victim's house shortly before the crime took place. Amy was able to identify Danny from a photo lineup, even though they didn't know each other in regular life. And she also described his clothing and his posture, which was very distinctive at the time that she saw him prior to the crime being committed. Well, Danny was brought in by the police and interviewed, and Wallace noticed that his posture, which was hunched due to an injury that he had suffered, matched Amy's description. And though Danny denied being in the area at the time of the murder, a gas receipt found in his car placed him a quarter-mile from the scene, and Danny's sister gave a statement to police that said that he had mentioned to her that he was going to visit the victim on the day of the crime. Now, Wallace says, quote, "Now, it's true that the gas receipt and his sister's statement alone would not prove that Danny murdered the victim, but those two additional facts did corroborate Amy's claims. If nothing else, her assertions were made more reasonable by her observations of Danny's unusual stance and these additional supporting facts. The gas receipt and Danny's sister's statement were independent of Amy, but still supported her assertions. Together, the internal and external evidence agreed with Amy's primary claims as an eyewitness." Wallace claims that there is internal and external evidence to corroborate the claims of the Gospels as well. The first example Wallace gives of internal corroborating evidence is the fact that the Gospels support each other when describing the same events, agreeing on the important details and filling in gaps in each other's accounts. And on this he says, quote, "This interdependence between the accounts could be explained in one of two ways. It may have been that the writers worked together, writing at precisely the same time and location to craft a clever lie so subtle that very few people would even notice it at all. The second possibility is that the Gospels were written by different eyewitnesses who witnessed the event and included these unplanned supporting details. They were simply describing something that actually happened. Or, because there is a third possibility, isn't there? And given the conclusions of a consensus of modern biblical scholars across the last almost 200 years, it's the most likely possibility. It's the possibility that the later Gospels were written using the earlier Gospels as sources, and that they are in fact not eyewitness accounts at all, but embellished rewrites. What's odd is that Wallace has already acknowledged that the Gospel of Mark was written first and was used as a source by Matthew and Luke. So does he not think that what he describes as the interdependence of the Gospels might be attributable to that, rather than to each Gospel being an independently written eyewitness account? And by the way, Wallace has already acknowledged as well that the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts, at least not completely, especially in the case of the Gospel of Luke, which he says is based on eyewitness testimony, but a third party writing a story based on eyewitness testimony is not eyewitness testimony. He talks about the Gospels as though they were written by eyewitnesses, but he has said previously in this book that what he means is that the Gospels were written by people who were using eyewitness accounts as their sources. That's a very different thing, and it's a little sneaky that Wallace keeps trying to make that shift from based on eyewitness accounts to eyewitness accounts. Anyway, back to what I was saying a moment ago. Here's how absurdly charitable Wallace's argument is to the traditional Christian view of who wrote the Gospels. He acknowledges the similarities between Mark and Matthew and Luke. But instead of allowing for the possibility that Matthew and Luke were sourced from Mark, he argues that the authors of Matthew and Luke merely referred to Mark's account to be sure that they got their details right. They were still writing their own independent accounts based on eyewitness testimony. It's just that they were glancing over at Mark's gospel every so often to make sure they weren't forgetting anything. The biased nature of Wallace's investigation becomes more obvious when he shares a few examples of this unintentional support which the Gospels contain for each other. To begin with, Wallace shares the example of Jesus calling his disciples. In Matthew, Jesus simply says to Peter and Andrew, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men," and they follow him right along, joined soon after by James and John, the sons of Zebedee. It might seem strange that they would just drop everything and follow Jesus, but Luke's gospel tells that same story and gives more detail, describing how Peter and Andrew first heard Jesus preach, and then they experienced a miraculously large harvest of fish. Jesus told them to cast their nets into the deep, and they pulled in so many more fish than they could possibly have imagined. And it was then that they followed Jesus. So the first disciples didn't just drop everything when Jesus said, "Come here." They were convinced by the message and by one of the miracles of Jesus. The next example that Wallace cites is the story of the striking of Jesus during his questioning before Caiaphas and the council. In Matthew, Jesus is struck, and then he is asked, "Who is the one that hit you?" And this doesn't really make much sense in that version of the story, but in the story as told by Luke, there's the added detail of Jesus being blindfolded, which makes the question a bit more sensible. Jesus is smacked by somebody, and then they ask him sort of mockingly, "Tell us who slapped you," as though they're asking him to prove that he has supernatural abilities. He can tell who smacked him even though he was blindfolded and couldn't have seen who it was. And finally, Wallace shares how the tellings of the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 change from Mark to Luke to John, and how they complement each other, with one answering questions that are raised by the others, and they all sort of combine to create a whole picture of this event, Jesus miraculously feeding the 5,000. And in every single one of those examples that Wallace shares, we see that the account as found in the gospel that was written first is retold with more detail in the gospels that were written later. Matthew tells a simple story of Jesus calling his disciples, and Luke, which was written years or perhaps even decades later, tells an expanded and embellished version of the same story. Matthew tells a story of Jesus being struck during his questioning and includes the odd detail of Jesus being asked to identify the person who just smacked him, and then Luke retells the story with a slight alteration, Jesus being blindfolded, to make sense of that odd detail. Though his estimates for when the Gospels were written are much earlier than the scholarly consensus, and his insistence that the Gospels were actually written by the traditionally attributed authors is also at odds with that consensus, Wallace does agree that Mark's Gospel was written first, followed by Matthew, followed by Luke, and he acknowledges that there is a great deal of material in Matthew and Luke that seems lifted from Mark, though he doesn't say lifted, he calls these references. Does it not occur to him that the later Gospels are simply repeating and embellishing stories from the earlier? That he doesn't even mention this as a possible explanation for the amount of material the Gospels have in common, and for the fact that the later versions contain more detail and more embellished versions of the same stories, doesn't say much for Wallace's integrity as an investigator. Well, there's another example of internal corroborating evidence for the Gospels, and that is that the Gospel writers referenced names and locations that were historically correct for the period in which they were written. To demonstrate this, Wallace says that the usage of names in the New Testament is consistent with the names people actually had in Palestine in the first century. The New Testament authors also used names which are found in the same frequency in other literature from first century Palestine. And when a common name is used, it is often accompanied by a modifier to indicate the particular person being referenced. For instance, there are many characters named Simon, but they are differentiated by additional descriptions like Simon Peter, Simon the leper, Simon of Cyrene, and so on. Also, since Jesus was a fairly common name at the time, when people other than the author refer to Jesus, they often call him Jesus of Nazareth, or Jesus the Galilean, or Jesus who was called Christ, in order to distinguish him from someone else with the same name. Well, someone who insists that the Gospels were written in the 2nd century or later would probably have a more strenuous objection to this. Personally, I'm comfortable with the notion that Paul was writing in the mid-1st century and that the Gospels came later in the mid to late 1st century or possibly in the very early 2nd century. And that's really all Wallace proves here, provided that you find his evidence persuasive. He doesn't show that the occurrence of names in the Gospels prove they must have been written as early as he says they were. And he can't prove that unless he has data that breaks down the popularity of names in 1st century Palestine on a year-by-year basis, which, if he does, he doesn't share. He says the name occurrences are consistent with what we would expect to find in an eyewitness's account, but that observation isn't worth very much either, since it's also what we would expect to find from any 1st century Palestinian writer who was writing about 1st century Palestinian people, eyewitness to actual events or not. So that's the internal evidence that corroborates the Gospels as reliable historical sources. What about the external evidence? Well, Wallace says there's some of that too. He describes the non-Christian sources that mention Jesus, including, to start with, of course, Josephus, who mentions Jesus in his Antiquities of the Jews. And to his credit, Wallace quotes a version of the relevant passage from Josephus that omits the disputed description of Jesus as the Christ, and even goes on to explain that this description was probably added to the text by Christians hoping to amplify the reference to Jesus. So I want to point out that Wallace does give a fairly honest view of the passage from Josephus. Unfortunately for Wallace, that unamplified original version, or probable original version of the passage of Josephus, is evidence that a person named Jesus existed and had a following of people who believed he had returned from a death on the cross. And that's it. It doesn't establish that Jesus was supernatural or divine in any way. All it establishes is that a person named Jesus existed and that he had followers who had some extraordinary beliefs about him. Wallace also mentions Thallus, whose writings are lost today, but who was referenced by the Christian writer Sextus Julius Africanus in the 3rd century. Africanus cited Thallus as describing an earthquake and a most fearful darkness occurring in conjunction with the crucifixion of Jesus, just as is described in the Gospels. Africanus also reports that Thallus explained that the darkness was probably a solar eclipse. Wallace says, quote, "Even though Thallus denied that the darkness at the point of the crucifixion was caused supernaturally, he inadvertently corroborated the claim that Jesus was indeed crucified and that darkness covered the land when he died on the cross." Wallace wouldn't chalk the crucifixion darkness up to an eclipse, I suppose. He doesn't come right out and say he doesn't think it was an eclipse, but I imagine that would be his position. At least he wouldn't think it would be a natural eclipse. And in the passage Wallace quotes, Africanus also doubts Thallus's conclusion that the eclipse was the cause of the crucifixion darkness. And both Wallace, if that is indeed Wallace's position, and Africanus are correct. The crucifixion darkness described in the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke was not a solar eclipse. Now, how can we say that? Well, we can say it for a few very good reasons. First, the longest a total solar eclipse can last is about 7.5 minutes. The crucifixion darkness is described as lasting 3 hours. Second, thanks to our precise observations of the positions of the sun and the moon relative to Earth, we can not only predict future eclipses, but we can know with a high degree of confidence when eclipses occurred in the past, how long they lasted, and from where on Earth they would have been visible. There are no eclipses in history that match the gospel account of the crucifixion darkness. There was a total eclipse that occurred in the year 29, which is a little early for the crucifixion, but it's in the ballpark. And it would have been visible in Jerusalem, but this total eclipse lasted less than 2 minutes, and in Jerusalem it wouldn't have been seen as a total eclipse, but a partial eclipse, and probably might not even have been noticed by many people. And this eclipse took place in late November, not during Passover, when the Gospels depict Jesus as being crucified. So, if the crucifixion darkness wasn't an eclipse, and it isn't mentioned by any historical source outside the Gospels, and according to Africanus, Thallus, what basis, other than a biased insistence that the Gospels must be telling the truth, do we have for believing that such an event occurred at all? Wallace doesn't dwell too long on the earthquake, which Thallus also is quoted by Africanus as corroborating, and that's probably just as well, since the earthquake is only mentioned in one of the Gospels, and it's Matthew, the same one that describes the Jerusalem zombie invasion that history somehow failed to record. It's worth mentioning briefly that Thallus doesn't seem to be that great of a source, full stop. Practically nothing is known about him, including precisely when he lived, or if Thallus was even his actual name. There's an excellent analysis of Thallus by Richard Carrier on the secular web, which I will link in the description of this video. It's titled Thallus and Analysis. You can read it for yourselves if you're so inclined. And in that analysis, Carrier describes how difficult it is to accurately date when Thallus wrote his histories, writing that based on what Thallus wrote about and when the earliest references to Thallus are that we still have, he might have written anywhere from the 2nd century BC to the 2nd century AD. And that is hardly the rock-solid witness to the crucifixion that Wallace needs Thallus to be. Well, moving on, Wallace also mentions references to Jesus in the writings of Tacitus, Marabar Serapion, and Phlegon. And these sources corroborate only the most general and mundane details of the Jesus narrative. The fact that Jesus existed, that he had followers, that his followers believed him to be the Christ. That's all we can say is supported by these external sources. And Phlegon did supposedly describe Jesus as being able to predict the future, but there are two very important factors to consider, neither of which Wallace emphasizes in his relating of the importance of Phlegon. First, Phlegon's works are largely lost, and the actual references to Jesus are only known through descriptions of what Phlegon wrote by later Christian writers. And second, Phlegon lived in the 2nd century. So, again, his account wouldn't have been good for much other than simply establishing what some people believed about Jesus, which is no more than the other sources do. So Phlegon is not that impressive of a source if your aim is to prove that Jesus was supernatural and worked miracles and returned from the dead. There's also archaeological evidence which corroborates the Gospels, Wallace says. For instance, archaeological discoveries show that Quirinius was a government official at the time when Jesus would have been born, corroborating Luke's account of the census that sent Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem. Archaeology also establishes the existence of someone named Lysanias, mentioned by Luke, living at the right time, and it also corroborates the existence of the pools of Bethlehem and Siloam, which were mentioned by John. And we also have evidence that Pontius Pilate really existed and that crucifixion was actually practiced as a method of execution by the Romans at this time. So that's all this corroborating evidence of these various details of the Bible. Again, these are not terribly controversial details. These are not the details on which the arguments between skeptics of Wallace's view and people who hold Wallace's view are based. But that Quirinius bit requires a bit more explanation, because that's a little interesting. History records that a governor of Syria named Quirinius conducted a census in the year 6 AD. And this is usually thought to be the census mentioned in the Gospel of Luke, which names Quirinius as being the governor of Syria. The problem is that Luke, the supposedly careful and reliable historian, also says that Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great, who was king of Judea. But Herod the Great died 10 years before the census of Quirinius. So instead of just saying, hey, looks like Luke made a mistake, which would be more charitable than Luke made some shit up, which is also a conclusion you could come to quite reasonably, Wallace and some of his fellow apologists say, well, what probably happened was Quirinius had another job in the government before he was appointed governor. Maybe he had even served an earlier unrecorded term as governor. Just because we have that one record of his term of governor from the years 5 to 6 AD doesn't mean that he wasn't governor before. And it was then, in one of those earlier terms, or while Quirinius had that previous job, that the census, which Luke mentions, must have taken place. So it's not the historically recorded census of Quirinius that is described in Luke, but a different census, which Quirinius had something to do with, that took place before Herod the Great died. And it's this earlier presence of Quirinius, or someone named Quirinius, in government of the time that Wallace says has been established by archaeological evidence. So that is the workaround of the contradiction of, well, Herod was dead during the census of Quirinius, so how could Jesus have been born after the census of Quirinius but before the death of Herod? Well, it was a different census, and it was either a different Quirinius, or Quirinius was governor earlier or had a different job or whatever. There's a lot of pieces that have to be moved around to make that work, but Wallace apparently thinks that he has made it work, so more power to him. I get, actually, why Wallace and others would want to dissociate the census referenced in Luke from the census of Quirinius of 6 AD. For one thing, there is that discrepancy involving the death of Herod, but for another thing, there's the fact that the census of Quirinius of 6 AD didn't involve people returning to their ancestral homes. So it would not have required Joseph and Mary to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem. And in terms of plot, that's the only reason that census appears in the nativity narrative, to get Joseph and Mary from Nazareth to Bethlehem. The problem for Wallace is there is no evidence that such a census requiring people to return to their ancestral homes ever took place during the reign of Herod the Great or during any other time. Viewed without the pro-Christian confirmation bias, it looks a lot more like a narrative contrivance invented by the author of Luke, or somebody, than a reference to an actual historical event. So, if the corroborating evidence for the Gospels is so strong, and I don't think it is, but let's just go with it. Wallace says that the corroborating evidence is really strong. So if it is, why are there still so many people who don't believe it, who aren't convinced, people like this guy? Well, Wallace has a few ideas. Skeptics don't trust non-Christian writers whose works only survive through references by later Christian writers. That could be one reason. Skeptics are unwilling to give the gospel authors the benefit of the doubt. But a lot of it comes back to an objection Wallace has addressed a couple of times before. Quote, "The Gospels contain descriptions of the supernatural, healings, prophetic utterances, and miracles. Because critics deny the possibility of such things, they reject the biblical accounts and look for ways to describe them as fallacious. It is this presupposition that drives many skeptics to claim that the Gospels were written late in history, far from the region where the miraculous events reportedly occurred. How else could the Gospel writers have fooled so many people with these stories about the supernatural? Certainly, they couldn't have written these accounts at a time or place in which the true eyewitnesses could expose their fabrications, could they?" Well, first, as I've said a few times in this series already, while many skeptics of Christianity do argue that the Gospels were written very late, it's entirely possible to accept the opinion of the consensus of biblical scholars that the Gospels were written in the late 1st century, and still reject the claims that Jesus was the Son of God and worked miracles and returned from the dead. The propositions that the Gospels were written relatively early and that the Gospels aren't historically reliable are not mutually exclusive. This is a classic apologist argument. I first encountered it way back in my first An Atheist Read series when I reviewed Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ. Remember that? The background of my shot was slightly different. You could see a slightly different portion of my living room. I had a fish tank back there. I had not yet committed to the black t-shirt look. Good times. Anyway, the argument goes that if the Gospels were written relatively early within the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses to Jesus, then they must have been fairly accurate, because any inaccuracies would have been weeded out of the stories by people who knew better. No stories about Jesus that were out-and-out fiction could ever have caught on in the way the Gospels did, because everyone would know that they weren't true. Well, this argument is bogus, and there is a really obvious bit of evidence for its bogusness, and I will show it to you right now. And I apologize for repeating myself, because I have used this example in a past An Atheist Read series, but it's this. It's the Book of Mormon. That is an excellent example of why this is a bogus argument. But don't worry, it was a free copy. I didn't pay for the Book of Mormon. They give it away. Thanks, Mormons. The Book of Mormon was supposedly written by Joseph Smith, who translated it from writing he found on magic golden plates that were shown to him by an angel. All right, so I think it's safe to say that the contents of the Book of Mormon and the circumstances under which it was written are highly suspect to anyone who isn't a Mormon. It's extremely likely that Joseph Smith, who had a history of fraud and various other crimes, just made it up. No golden plates, no magic seer stones to help him translate, no angel Moroni, none of it happened. He made it all up. The fantastic sequence of events that led Smith to write or translate, as he claimed, the Book of Mormon supposedly occurred in the early 19th century, well within the sphere of recorded history, far more accessible to modern historians than first century Palestine. And unlike the Gospels, we have witnesses who signed their names and swore that they saw the golden plates from which the Book of Mormon was translated. These witnesses testified that an angel showed them the golden plates, and that was the first group of 3 witnesses, and another group of 8 witnesses testified that they were shown the plates by Joseph Smith, and they were actually allowed to handle them. They held the golden plates in their hands, and they signed statements attesting to this. Several of these witnesses eventually came into conflict with Smith, and they were excommunicated from the church, but even then, none of them ever went on record to deny their testimony. And the testimony of the 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses is still contained in every copy printed of the Book of Mormon. There is the testimony of the 3 witnesses, signed by their names: Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, Martin Harris, and then after that, the testimony of the 8 witnesses with their names: Christian Whitmer, Jacob Whitmer, Peter Whitmer, John Whitmer, Hiram Page, Joseph Smith Sr., Hiram Smith, Samuel H. Smith. I know there's a lot of Smiths there. It's probably a little suspect, but the point is, we have names of witnesses who were willing to sign on the dotted line and swear to everybody for all of history that they saw an angel, they saw golden plates, Joseph Smith was telling the truth, and even after they fell out with Joseph Smith, they still did not recant their testimony. And today, less than 200 years after its founding, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the church that Joseph Smith founded, the body that is typically referred to casually as the Mormon Church, has over 15 million members worldwide. It's the 4th largest religion in the United States. In 2012, a Mormon, Mitt Romney, was the Republican Party's nominee for President of the United States. How in the world could this faith have caught on so quickly and grown so extensive and so prosperous if it were based on lies using J. Warner Wallace's logic? Wouldn't the people alive at the time who knew Joseph Smith, who knew his reputation as a con artist, who knew there were no golden plates, who knew there was no angel, that Smith was no prophet, wouldn't these people and their skepticism and their knowledge, their knowing better, have strangled Smith's church before it had a chance to grow? If Wallace's argument is valid, if the Gospels were written within the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses of Jesus, and they must therefore be true, how does he explain the existence of the Mormon Church? More to the point, why isn't Wallace a Mormon himself? The corroborating evidence for the Book of Mormon, including the signed witnesses to the angel and the golden plates, is far superior to anything we have for the Gospels. It's not even close. Joseph Smith was also said to be a prophet, to have been gifted with a divine ability to translate the golden plates, and he's also said to have performed miraculous healings and to have cast out evil spirits. Does Wallace doubt these claims? If he does, and I presume he does, why? Does he have a naturalistic bias? Wallace winds down the chapter with this, quote, "Is it reasonable to infer that the Gospels are sufficiently corroborated, even when considering the limits of archaeology and the limits of internal literary analysis? The most reasonable inference from the evidence is that the Gospels are incredibly reliable, especially considering the nature of such accounts. Few ancient records have been as critically examined as the New Testament Gospels. Few other documents from antiquity have been as heavily challenged and scrutinized. This prolonged scrutiny has given us a robust and detailed set of evidences that we can examine with abductive reasoning." You know, it is fascinating to see Wallace tout the level of critical examination and scrutiny to which the New Testament documents have been subjected, and then utterly disregard the conclusions the great majority of modern scholars have reached as a result of that critical scrutiny. The result of subjecting the New Testament to critical scrutiny is this: they probably weren't written by the traditional authors. They probably weren't written as early as Wallace says they were. He's off by a couple of decades at least. And there is very little corroborating evidence for their accounts, and what evidence we do have only substantiates the least controversial details, not the extraordinary claims that are actually the main points of contention between traditionalists like Wallace and more skeptical biblical scholars, most of whom, I remind you, are Christians themselves. Wallace claims to value critical analysis, but all he's shown us so far are the same sort of pseudo-intellectual acrobatics that I've seen from a dozen apologists before him. The truth of the Bible and the divinity of Jesus Christ is the only conclusion he will accept, and he'll selectively interpret or conveniently ignore whatever evidence he has to in order to reach that conclusion. Only with Wallace, it might be worse than with those other apologists, because he is a trained investigator who is supposed to know better. That's it for Chapter 12. That's it for this video. In the next video, I will be back with a look at Chapter 13. Were they accurate? That'll be an interesting question to explore. I want to thank you folks, as always, for joining me. Please leave a comment on this video. Tell me if you agreed with me or disagreed with me. Tell me if I got something right. Tell me if I got something wrong. Whatever your thoughts are on what I've had to say in this video, be you an atheist or a Christian or some other category of belief or non-belief, I'd be very interested to hear what you have to say. I also want to remind you that if you did enjoy this video, please like it and share it and subscribe to my channel if you're not subbed already. And also, please consider helping me to make more videos like this one by supporting this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron. As little as $1 a month really helps me out. I appreciate all of you who have become patrons so far, and I appreciate all of you who are going to become patrons in the future. I couldn't do it without you. You really improve my life, and you make this series and all of the other videos I do possible. So thank you very much for all your support, and I will see you in the next video.